number 6, Craig Allen is talking about the global emergence of hotter-drought drivers of forest disturbance tipping points. My name is Henrik Hartmann from the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry. Before starting this seminar, as always, we give a very short introduction of who we are and what our intentions are. For at least for the newcomers, this may be relevant and interesting. So we're an interdisciplinary initiative aiming to understand trends and causes of tree death via global assessment of tree mortality. Interdisciplinary means that we're trying to combine different disciplines like forest inventories and remote sensing to get more data in a common database or in a common framework that allows us actually to make inferences on trends and causes of tree mortality. We try to identify mortality hotspots where we look at the ecophysiology in order to implement this into modeling and then improve forecasting of future mortality trends. We have started off as an IUFO task force. I don't want to list the members here. You're welcome to visit our web pages. And then we have augmented our both the core team but also the membership in order to also be able to welcome non-IUFO organizations. And we have given ourselves a nice and highly competent scientific advisory board that helps us guide us through in order to achieve our objectives. Just a bit of information. So if you have relevant tree mortality papers or you want to see interesting tree mortality papers, we have this Twitter account, and under the hashtag tree mortality paper, you can find relevant and new information. The webinar series takes place every 4 to 8 weeks. Note though that now is the summer break until September and October, so don't expect anything during the summer times. If you have suggestions for topics that you would like to cover or you want to cover something yourself, please contact us via our Gmail account, which is shown here. And also you can find it on our webpage. So today's webinar will be first a presentation of about 45 minutes, depending on Craig. And we know that Craig likes to talk and he's giving very interesting presentations. So stick even to the presentation, even if it takes 50 minutes. Then followed 15 minutes of question and answers. And please use the Q&A function to ask your question at any time during that presentation. Please do not use the chat. That is really to report technical difficulties or anything like this. We apologize if your question is not selected, but we try to combine questions that go somewhere into the same direction. But usually there are so many of them that we do not have the time to address all of them. So now Craig Allen is now an adjunct professor at the University of New Mexico. He has retired from the USGS this year, but we all know that Craig won't remain silent. He is going to continue working on tree mortality. So he's a research forest ecologist. He's interested in fire ecology, historical ecology, global change, and also in particular drought-induced tree mortality. So this is the title of your talk, Global Emergence of Hotter-drought Drivers of Forest Disturbance Tipping Points. So Craig, we're looking forward to your presentation. You should be able to share it now.
Okay. And I think you should be seeing the first slide. Henrik, is that true?
Yes, we see it. Everything's fine.
Right.
You can go.
All right, very good. Thank you. Yes, thank you to the task force and Henrik for the invitation to speak. And how do I just want to, just 1 second, I want to change what I see because I don't want to be seeing so many people. Okay. So yes, so I am going to talk about the global emergence of hotter drought drivers of forest disturbance tipping points today. Oh. Really, what it'll be very specifically talking about is just how hotter drought extremes increasingly drive these big, fast changes in forests near and far. I'm going to focus on a couple temperature-related forest disturbances, physiological drought stress related die-off without specifying what, the amplification and association of that with tree-killing insects, and fire. We'll talk a bit about fire. But of course, there are quite a number of other temperature-related forest disturbances, but these will not be talked about really today. I have, for over 40 years now, been working in this part of the Southern Rocky Mountains in northern New Mexico, where the red dot is, based at the south end of the Rockies, in where these montane forests came out. I arrived in the early 80s. And did master's and PhD work there, and have been continuously doing field work. This is the 41st year in a row, studying landscape change here. And I arrived in this wet period when it was a good place to be a tree in a forest. But I was reconstructing past changes in the landscape, and we know there's a lot of variability, climate variability, precip variability was well known in this landscape, and had reconstructed prior to this wet period, there was a severe drought in the 1950s. And so this reconstructive, using multiple lines of evidence, and later used tree ring dating of the dead carcasses to reconstruct this ecotone shift. So this was on my radar screen for some time. And indeed, I and others said, yeah, well, the next time it goes multi-year dry, we can expect the system to start to behave differently. And indeed, starting in the late 90s, and certainly since 2000, that change has occurred. And to a significant degree, what I've done is document what's been unfolding in the landscapes in front of me. And having established a number of long-term data sets during that wet period as a baseline of that time period, have watched things changed and documented it. And it turns out that temperature, it's not just the drought, but what's different today is it's warmer. And Park Williams in this paper, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, really put a point on it. Park used the very abundant tree ring resources of the Southwest US, Arizona and New Mexico area down there in yellow on the little map. And reconstructed, so basically an empirical model of regional forest growth, and modeled it relative to, so this is growth, averaged regionally across Arizona and New Mexico, the Southwest. And then linked it to, created a forest drought stress index, this FDSI, which is basically the empirical model based on preceding winter precip and primarily growing season daily max temperature, which here you'll see it as VPD because they were basically equivalent statistically. And we think VPD is what was driving it. But you see the R and R squared values down there. This is really the sort of strongest climate predictor of tree growth. It's at the regional scale. Turns out it's working at some mountain range scales as well. People are working on it. But so it allows us to do a number of things, but that VPD part was new, the temperature signal in there. Everybody knew precip mattered, but the warmer temperatures, when it's warmer during the growing season, trees grow more poorly. And these are gymnosperms, these are conifers that almost all these data are from. So here's a 1,000-year record of synonymously almost of either tree growth regionally or this forest drought stress index from 81,000 through 2007. The gray lines are the individual values of FDSI, and below zero, it's stressful, and above zero, it's not. It's good to be trees. And the red is the 10-year smooth. So the gray is the annual. And what you see is the variability in tree growth, and these two climate drivers is quite large in the Southwest. There's nothing new associated with that. What was new was the temperature part of the signal. Here are a couple of the major droughts of the last 1,000 years. The two older ones, the late 1200s, mega droughts, as people called them, but multi-decadal with almost no good years. But it was cooler back then. The last significant historical drought prior to the current one was the 1950s drought, marked here. And we know from both the 50s drought and also from circa 1900 and even the late 1500s mega drought, that when you get down to this minus 1.5 level, it's a bit arbitrary, that's enough to kill trees. So we have that threshold out there. And then just one more point on this for context. This circled year in the bottom right corner is 2002. And we're going to talk about that year for a minute, because that year empirically was the worst year for tree growth by far in the last 1,000 years. You can scan across and see there's nothing like it, not even in the teeth of these most severe mega droughts of the last 1,000 years. And that, we believe, is that temperature signal, that being warm during the growing season, that's amplifying the drought stress. And this is what the US has this Drought Monitor system. It's not entirely empirical, but this is what it looked like summer of 2002, with drought centered on the extreme drought, exceptional drought centered on the Four Corners region of the US. And this is what that looked like on the ground. This is what that did. Millions of hectares of trees died. In this case, what you're seeing is Pinus edulis. Again, many of you have seen this sort of photo pair that I took. The red dot is the same tree. So all the trees turning orange are Pinus edulis, a small pine tree. The stuff that's still green 18 months later is a juniperus, one-seed juniper. But this is going up and down. Tree mortality is happening up and down the elevational gradient from the very lowest margins of trees, small trees, up into subalpine forests. It took a year or two for the higher elevation forests to actually start to show much mortality, but it was also affecting grasses and shrubs. And so even though bark beetles get a lot of the attention, there was mortality. 70% of the dominant grass cover in those same woodlands that those pinon were dying, and 70% of it died back in 2002, 2003. Anyway, this was a real in-your-face moment. People, and the magnitude of it was more severe than the 1950s drought, even though the precipitation deficit was similar. Thus, this kind of presentation of the change as a global change type drought, meaning a hotter drought, a warmer drought. In addition to all the dieback and mortality that was going on, fire activity also amplified greatly from what had been going on. In the wet period, fire suppression was still effective in the Southwest region. And it turns out that these warmer drought conditions really drove increase in not just bark beetle area. So here you can see this forest drought stress index turns out is a pretty good predictor of, in the Southwest region at the regional scale, of the area mapped from airplanes of being affected by drought and bark beetle die-off, as well as the area of tree killing fire, high severity, moderate and high severity fire, wildfire in the region, noting the log scale there. And this is what that looked like on the ground for the period for where the bright red is tree killing fire and the orange is bark beetles mapped by airplanes. The wildfires mapped by satellite for the period from 1984 to 2012. But I can tell you that almost all of that was 1996 to 2012. And we should update this because there's a lot more has continued to go on since then. But even by that point, by 2012, it was about 20% of the wooded area of this region, Southwest region, was being affected. We're also seeing novel, new insect outbreak dynamics. These are the very south end of the Rocky Mountains. Those are 12,000-foot peaks right above Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is in the municipal water supply for the city, which is in a wilderness area up in subalpine Aves and Picea forest. And this little caterpillar down here, Janet's looper, it's a little brown moth, had never even been documented in northern New Mexico. There was one documented outbreak in southern New Mexico 15 years ago or 20 near the Mexico border. But this organism actually feeds in the wintertime, chews on the needles. And so the warming of the winter temperatures has apparently allowed this, it's a native insect, to move north. And it is now at the south end of the Rockies and may indeed well start moving farther north as warming. But these are the kind of novel things that we're starting to see in these landscapes. And there are these nonlinear tipping points, these thresholds where when winter gets warm enough, all of a sudden this organism, it can follow its life cycle in a new way. Just in the first decade of the 2000s, we had many tens of millions of hectares of trees being killed by combinations of drought and bark beetles. This is a beetle-centric view of it put together by entomologists for that first decade, where the different colors are the dominant tree-killing beetle species. But it has continued. This California from 2012 to 2016 got its own version of the brutal drought, which it eased a little bit, but the last 2 years has amplified again. But it's killed, well, a lot of trees. People are working on the numbers, but in the southern Sierra Nevada, probably more than 100 million trees. And a lot of these are big trees. And even more concerning has been what it has done to fire behavior and area burned. Fires in the last half dozen years have just become increasingly uncontrollable. The fire season west-wide is 2 to 3 months longer. In places like California, it's now year-round. There is no off-season, but it's the severity of the fire behavior. These are, of course, Sequoiadendron gigantea. These are the world's most massive trees, and some of the ones on the right are pushing 300 feet, some of them. And crown fire, one fire, it is now estimated, Nate Stevenson's and others, they're working on a report, it's being peer reviewed now, but they estimate 10 to 14% of all giant sequoia trees, monarch trees, the big ones, died in this single castle fire in the southern Sierra Nevada last fall. But as you see, pushing 2 million hectares burned in California alone last year. In the end of September, John Abatzoglu and Phil Higuera put this out kind of quick in Global Change Biology, because already it was looking like a crazy fire year. And you can see this was through the end of September, 1.8 million, no, excuse me, that's the wrong scale over here, whatever that would be, like 2.7 million hectares burned at that point. Well, by the end of the calendar year, that went up to 4.3 million hectares. But what you see driving at the relationships, you'll see a couple graphs here in the next few slides. We're not going to go in detail, but VPD, temperature, VPD, it's dry, but it's also really hot. And we're seeing these again, fire is one of those very nonlinear processes. Things, it's hard to get it to burn. It won't burn, it won't burn. But once it does, boom, the switch goes on. And then actually it has some positive feedbacks in and of itself based on the energy that's being released by the process of fire. Abatzoglu, John and Park Williams put this out also last year. And this is for the whole Western US, but what you see is fuel aridity and the closeness of fuel aridity as a driver of forest area through time. And you see the most recent time period, and it only went through 2015. Every one of the fire years since then has been huge somewhere in the West, but it's tied really closely to these two temperature sensitive variables, ET and VPD. And this just came out just a week or two ago. Nice work, again, led by Phil Higuera, who's a kind of a crossover paleoecologist, but has done tons of charcoal work. And he combined observational records, tree ring fire histories, and 20 charcoal records from north central Colorado, all in subalpine, which are the highest forests, these spruce fir forests in the Rocky Mountains. And basically 2020 was off the charts. You had 250,000 hectares burning in Colorado, and most of that was burned in late September, but into October, which usually you're getting snow by that time there. Anyway, these years, it's starting to look, no matter how we look at it, increasingly anomalous. And we're expecting more of it this year. Indeed, there's fires cranking. My view of the mountains out my window here from my home study is obscured by smoke coming from Arizona. But this is the Drought Monitor. And if you remember '02, it looks worse in the Southwest this year in 2021. And this is not just in dry places, Central Europe. This is emerging in new landscapes. Henrik's leading a compilation of examples from around the world where people have been surprised a bit, as we were to some extent in the Southwest. Even, I mean, we knew this could happen, but at some level that drought would recur, and that when it did, things like dieback and fire would be a bigger deal. But the warming, the pace at which this has happened, the speed and the magnitude of the impact on the landscapes, on the forests, and not just forests, all kinds of components of the ecosystem has really got people's attention, and it's starting to emerge in other places. There's particular reasons, I think, why the Southwest US, it emerged somewhat early relative globally and big. And if we have time, I may mention that later. But yeah, these are just views, beech trees, dying spruce trees. Many of you, the Europeans, certainly not only know this stuff, you're the folks working on turning this out. This came out recently, and it highlights one of the elements of these kind of Hotter-drought disturbance processes is compounding of it, that there's lagged effects and compounding effects. And so it's the back-to-back dry and hot summers almost certainly seem to have amplified the effects. And recently, Bill Andrig and others kind of scaled that up globally in terms of the repeated extreme droughts and the sensitivity of they parsed out all kinds of interesting relationships in this one globally. But compound events definitely seem to amplify it. Going to another part of the world, Katinka Ruthroff, George Matusek, and others there out of Perth in Southwest Australia. Spring of, well, our spring, their fall, 2011. 2010 was the driest year on record and the second warmest, and that hotter drought led to something that was unprecedented for them. This abrupt canopy collapses, this dieback in these eucalyptus marginata forests, these jarrah forests. They've done a lot of really good work on that since, including linking it to that same heat wave had big impacts in the adjoining oceans off the west side of Australia. Impacts on the sort of the biodiversity equivalent of the tropical rainforests, coral reefs and whatnot. Even mangroves are dying in places from these hotter drought events. And there's people starting to work more on this. This was a big one in the northeast coast of Australia. But anyway, these events are happening. And then sticking with Australia and shifting to the other big disturbance we're looking at today, fire. 1920, their summer of 2019, 2020 was, as I'm sure, well, many of you are probably from Australia, perhaps, was off the charts. It was the hottest, 2019 was the hottest year on record continentally and the driest. And it led to just this extraordinary pulse, especially in southeastern Australia, but to some extent continent-wide, of extreme fire events. You heard Melinda Bedlin recently. Medlin spoke somewhat about what this had done for trees and following the progress of dieback and recovery. But yeah, the the evidence is getting clearer. The canaries are getting cooked. We, from a public standpoint, it's starting to be more and more clear. And from a policy standpoint, the pressure is building to take action. This just came out just again in the last week or two, nice by Uli Paulus and John Keeley, nice synthesis of drivers, global change related drivers of wildfire. And it's not primarily climate change focused because there are other drivers, but what I would just note, all three of these graphs, there's these non-linear relationships between drought, ignitions, fuel continuity. There are these kind of nonlinear thresholds, these tipping point responses are embedded in both physical systems like sea ice and melt to all the way into biological components and ecosystem components of the system. And it's part of what makes predicting things and modeling things so challenging, because they're embedded at everything to the levels of the biochemistry of the cells. There's certain temperature ranges that things work, and you exceed that and all of a sudden it doesn't. And anyway, climate change has some big effects, both directly through warming, but also through drought. Changes in lightning ignitions in some places are changing, like up in the Arctic, we're getting more lightning ignitions. Wind events are also huge drivers, fire weather. Anyway, there's a number of ways for nonlinearity, but Hotter-drought is one of them, climate-wise, that's really having some significant effects on fire behavior in many parts of the world. And you're seeing little hints of it in some more relatively mesic places like Europe, northern. I mean, it's been in the Mediterranean drier portions, but in the more mesic central and northern Europe. Anyway, when you're in one of these, and when your landscape is, it feels a bit like a forest apocalypse of all these different disturbance processes that are going on affecting your trees and your forests, and then the watersheds and all the biodiversity, everything. It gets your attention when it happens in your place. And it happened relatively early here, the early 2000s, it was not possible to ignore it as an ecologist. I mean, it was, many of us were working on these kind of things. And yet, when you make these presentations and start sharing this, both in writing and presentations, there was some sense that in many places, people are like, don't worry, our trees are growing better than we've ever measured them before. And yeah, we can see theoretically that might be an issue, but not yet. It's going to be a while. But we see, going back to dieback, alone forest die-off and tree mortality processes, drought and heat-induced tree mortality has been emerging in the last couple of decades in all major forest biomes on planet Earth. And with colleagues in 2010, we assembled published literature from all these different places and have updated that a few times since. But in that first overview paper, the bottom line was that we could already see that during extreme events, combinations of drought and heat, all forest types already are vulnerable to tree mortality, accelerated, amplified tree mortality. Although our baselines aren't that good, I mean, there's all kinds of caveats about we don't have good data on the trend, certainly not globally. And second of all, we have some major information gaps that constrain our ability to document and predict tree mortality in response to projected climate change. And I would note, by the way, that almost all of those key information gaps, progress is being made, in some cases good progress, but they remain major information gaps that continue to constrain our ability to model effectively, realistically. A little side conversation here about, well, I don't know if it's a side, I think it's super important, but warming's particularly bad news in many cases for big and old trees, the charismatic megaflora of this planet. Not always. In some die-off events, there's smaller plants who are less deeply rooted, or there's a whole variety of reasons. And again, in the Southern Sierra Nevada, Nate Stevens and Adrian Das have done some really good work documenting how biotic agents and the bark beetles, how selectively that sometimes they select bigger trees, and that can influence the distribution. It isn't purely drought and heat stress that's killing trees, But on the ground in the real world, it's what sets that up to happen. But in any case, it's particularly bad news for big old trees. There's theoretical reasons to think that. There's empirical observational evidence to support that in various ways. One that's being better documented from Central America. This is nice. This is a nice piece of work about the importance of lightning, basically picking off big canopy emergence, and canopy emergence are important in these systems. And it's a major cause of mortality for these big old trees. We see there's not been work documenting the drought and heat stress, but it has been hotter and drier in some of these places. And the biggest and oldest baobabs, which by C14 dating are over 1,000 years old, they have been going down in the last decade. David Lindemeyer and colleagues have been doing a lot of work looking at big old trees on this planet. And in this particular synthesis, they looked at all these key processes, but note that they say that they excluded climate change from here. But nonetheless, these are climate and temperature related, drought and heat stress related drivers of actual tree mortality here. So while they weren't thinking of it through a climate change lens particularly, it's implicitly in there. And there are, when you look at just some big picture, broad scale observations of trees, there's some evidence of what warming. Imagine in the cases I'm going to present here in the next just couple slides that, for instance, here in deciduous angiosperms in the northern hemisphere, temperate forests, they live longer where it's cooler. All right. So for trees that can't move, warming, you might wonder what that will do to the longevity and thus the mortality rates. In China, somewhat similarly, if you recent synthesis looking at where the oldest trees are, you find that, again, they are living in upland areas that are cooler. So if you look at these tall eucalypt forests, the macroecology of them in Australia, you see that here the metric is biomass, and there's greater biomass in these forests where it's cooler. Again, what will warming do to these things? I mean, some of it's directly, but some of these stands were stands that got hammered by, for instance, high severity fire a year and a half ago. And then if you just look at the biomass globally at the thing, you'll see here in this kind of three-dimensional space that the above ground biomass is where it's coolest and wettest. That's where the big biomass sits. So again, in as much as climate change certainly is making things warmer essentially everywhere, but maybe making drought extremes, which is a filter that big old trees have to get through, these forests are at risk. Anyway, there's a lot of both observational and theoretical reasons to think that these ancient iconic trees and forests on this planet are at increasing risk, great risk, including, of course, the tallest, the most massive, the oldest organisms. And even though so much of it has been lost because of human land use things, what we have left is still impressive and still important for many reasons. In the tropics, some of these trees are older than we think. Tree ring dating it's really a frontier area. It is possible to do on a lot of trees there, it seems, but not as many people and not as much work. But radiocarbon dating shows that some of these big trees in the Amazon are, again, over 1,000 years old. There's a lot at risk here. And why does this matter? Biodiversity. There's all kinds of unique, big old trees create unique habitat structures that many organisms, both plants and animals, are adapted to. A whole variety of other ecosystem services, in particular hydrology. There's increasing interest on this. I mean, in the Amazon alone, this is one of the best looked at ones because of the concern tied to deforestation and fire here. But but and stand transpiration, so much of the precip is recycled in these systems. And it turns out, if you look, it's the biggest trees, the canopy trees, are transpiring 26% of the rainfall. 26% of that recycled water is coming out of the big old trees alone, not counting even the interception component of it. It is a lot. Anyway, their survival matters. Other values, scientific, the paleo records, we touched on that, but even in places that are surprising, in the eastern US, on some river estuaries, this is a gymnosperm, this is bald cypress. Yeah, living trees, 2,600 years old. So much, almost everything out there had been cut in the big pulse of Euro-American settlement, but not all. And then global carbon balance, nothing new for you all, but again, these cool, wet places, these temperate rainforests are storing an immense amount of carbon. This wonderful piece of work, I love this, by Jim Lutz and many colleagues, looking at over 5.5 million tree stems from the large permanent plots around the planet in old growth forests. And what you see is that in tropical forests, if you look at the largest 1% of the diameter trees in those plots from across the latitudinal gradient, and how much of the above ground biomass is in those big old trees, it can be as much as 80% in these tropical forests. Point is, those big old trees go down, that's a lot of carbon, a lot of stored carbon in this little moment in time when we're wanting to maintain as much carbon as possible and even add to it if we can, sequestration wise, till we get our act together with carbon emissions. Economic values, big old trees, obviously they're important commercially. Cultural values, everywhere on the planet, big old trees matter so much. They have so much meaning, there's stories, history, and just the intrinsic value of these things as the existence value. We care about them for spiritual reasons as well. Anyway, the world is getting warmer. It's going to continue to get warmer. That's the most robust part of the projections. We seem to be, this is from an older IPCC report, and yet this, we are now here and we are still on the curve, the fast curve. There's a lot of promising possibility of societies really, and we will see this decade, whether we start to bend this curve down to a lower emissions. But for the moment, we're on the fast track and the warming is matching it quite well. And we're here and we're already seeing these kinds of surprises and increases in mortality and disturbance processes in forests. One of the challenges, other than in sort of a general hand-waving sense that, oh yeah, it'll get worse, but from like a process modeling standpoint, these disturbances are hard to model. They're really hard to parameterize because in part, we're moving into uncharted territories. And there are these unforeseen threshold responses, these tipping points to increasingly novel, unprecedented, and extreme drought and heat events, as well as other kinds of things. And so the baseline is shifting, but it's the extremes. If you're a woody plant that you need to, if you want to maintain that above ground biomass, you got to get through not the means, but the extremes. And those are the filters. That's where the action happens. Hotter droughts are the droughts that are causing these kinds of major forest disturbance processes to just explode into behaviors we haven't seen before. And these disturbances are interactive often, the frequency, severity, and extent, and they're interactive. And so there's all kinds of synergies out there, and we can see them and we can conceptually kind of draw arrow diagrams, and yeah, they do this, but it's pretty hard to, at this point, nobody's models incorporate them process-wise yet. It's one of the big frontiers. People are working hard on it. But so we're getting surprised by these tipping point changes, and it's resulting in novel ecosystems. But where it leads us is fundamentally, I think, to that we literally still don't, we're navigating a bit blind in as much as the GCMs and our climate projections are at least for temperature, pretty solid. We still don't know whether the world's literally getting greener or browner because we cannot model mortality processes realistically enough yet in process-based models. Huge frontier, people are working on it. It's good to see so much more work going into this, but it's so there. This is an old kind of Jerry Franklin and others version of the Mannian spiral, death spiral, but it's complicated, and tree physiologists keep finding more and more processes that are involved in that matter. Anyway, a few of us think that because of this, and because a lot of our observations that we're on the cusp of these kind of tipping point changes that we're seeing emerge in some places first, but that a lot of our perspectives are conditioned by our historical perspectives, and history is no longer as good of a guide to what's happening in the future. And so this paper, again, and I'm sure many of you know as well, we tried to look at these contrasting perspectives and the evidence for them, but I'm only going to talk about one. Just want to highlight this. One of the really big ones that matters a lot in the models, the broad scale models, is the relative role of how strong of an effect will CO2 enrichment, ECO2, what is that going to do for the plants? How much does that help us? Is it going to save the day? Is it going to buffer and allow warming will it ameliorate those effects enough? And increasingly, there seems to be a lot of observational evidence suggesting that we may be nearing the end. It's not that this is a very nice paper from 2017, Josep Peñuelas and a number of others, looking at these different kinds of drivers, but it seems we have been pretty clearly from multiple lines of evidence in a period of increased MPP, and fertilization dominated in this framing, but that looks like it may be changing. And we're not going to talk about these, but I know that people who see the strong side, there's evidence supporting CO2 enrichment at a lot of different scales, but increasingly the observations on the ground, not in fine scale experiments, but on landscapes, is what makes some of us increasingly concerned about this. So anyway, a lot of work out there. It may indeed be that CO2 enrichment helps recovery after a disturbance event. So the resilience, it increases resilience, the ability to recover, depending on how strong that filter is of the actual disturbance event itself during the extreme event. Oh, that may be a duplicated slide. But anyway, there's increasing calls. I'm sure you all know these, we see them. But there's increasing concern over all of these, and a lot of it is observational based. Very recently, this came out by Martin DeCaw and Belinda and David, and I like the quote. I think this is true. I think there is pretty much a consensus that as a community, we understand that the question, does ECO2 ameliorate the drought impact, is time and context dependent. It depends. There's times and places it has been. The question is that we wonder, those of us who think hard about these disturbance processes, is that it's these extreme events, these are the filters, and we're not convinced that ECO2 is helpful in those periods. And what this does is, again, the second quote there is that we have limited confidence. This remains a huge uncertainty, and everybody knows it at this point, and a lot of people are working on it. But I did want to highlight one of the things that, ironically, that in as much as elevated CO2 is beneficial by ameliorating droughts, particularly mild to moderate droughts, or the warming, in many places, indeed, forests have been growing better than people have measured them. places where we haven't yet experienced Hotter-drought events. Central Europe would have been one of those places until just a few years ago. The Southwest US was one of those places in the 80s and 90s. It was the best tree growth in the last 1,000 years, the period from 1978 to 1995 in Arizona and New Mexico. And that changed abruptly again, in the late 90s, beginning in 2000, for sure. We have been in continuing drought. That actually a year ago in Science, Park Williams and a number of others say is now the second worst, first or second worst mega drought in the last 1,000 years regionally. It's equal to, if not yet exceeding, the 1580s. Anyway, the point I wanted to make with this is that, ironically, the good times preceding bad times can predispose forests, well, trees, individual trees. It scales from individual trees to stands to even landscapes, that by trees, when water is not limiting, are competing for light and space. And they will compete by growing lots of leaf area, investing in above ground woody structures, not investing as much relatively in below ground roots. And that can predispose you to amplified dieback. And it hasn't been published yet, but I'll show you in the next slide, but to structural overshoot can lead to mortality overshoot. And in the Southwest US, I think we've seen it. I think, and I won't explain this diagram, but basically this is the forest drought stress index. I won't explain it in detail, but what you're looking at there is that FDSI from 1897, which is the instrumental record, period through, Park updated through 2013, and the orange bands are the drought periods. So there was one circa 1900, there was one in the 1950s, centered on the 50s, and then the one we're in now that started in the late 90s. The blue are wet periods, and you can see that's basically tree growth. That FDSI is more or less synonymous with also regional tree growth. And that strong growth here of the period from the late 70s to the mid 90s made it so that when it abruptly turned dry and then hotter dry, we are now, all these trees had to shed leaf area, and then they're dying, and then they're burning. And this, I think, I see echoes of this in systems all over the planet. And indeed, there's a paper here that Jennifer Holm's been leading that came out of a workshop that involved a number of modelers a couple of years ago. And we're not going to go through this. And this is, again, not to reproduce. If you want to know more about it, talk to Jennifer. But you can hypothesize, and both observationally and with models, there is evidence that you can get this during the good times. Above the zero line, you can get this structural overshoot that then amplifies your vulnerability to mortality overshoot when resources, water becomes limiting with heat as an amplifying agent. And ECO2, the CO2 effects have helped until at some point they don't. And that's really the question, is what is the shape of these kind of curves moving forward? And it'll undoubtedly be time and place specific. But at some point that will scale globally. Anyway, I think there's pretty much a consensus. Forests are in the process of reorganizing. Ecosystems are. I mean, everything anybody looks at, we are now seeing it almost everywhere on the planet. And we're seeing these both direct and indirect through disturbance effects of drought and temperature, drought and heat, okay, have direct effects on these demographic processes, and then indirectly have effects through amplifying or altering these other disturbance agents. The net result of that is that, as sort of framed here in this paper a year ago, with a lot of people on it, is just that forests are changing, and we're seeing the forests are going to become shorter. They're going to be less productive. The dominant species composition is going to shift. And disturbance processes are a big part of what's going to be driving that, although also the change in the climate envelopes. So getting to the close here. So this task force that's sponsoring this, one of these key challenges that's out there is to better document and monitor diverse global patterns and trends of forest growth, health, and tree mortality. We don't have good data on all of this stuff. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that would be useful, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but I want to just note this last one here, that to support more confident projections of future forest dynamics and feedbacks, we're navigating a bit blind right now because we cannot realistically project vegetation dynamics moving forward precisely. And so both from a process modeling standpoint, having more data, literally just data, global monitoring of the patterns and trends would really help parameterize things, see how well the models are working, but it also provides opportunities for empirical modeling, which is what I'm going to end with here. Parks, I'll just remind you, Park Williams's Forest Drought Stress Index is an empirical model. It's based upon hundreds of thousands of measured tree rings, calibrated with climate from 1897 to present, and then extrapolated backward to give you this growth / forest drought stress index going backwards, but you can also project it forward because the two drivers, the two components of FDSI, forest drought stress index, preceding winter spring precip, average monthly, and temperature / VPD, the GCMs kick those out. And so you can run a number of GCMs. Park did this in that paper. And what you see, so this is that period of measured through 2007. This is FDSI, tree growth, if you will, through 2007, 1897, where we have the climate data. There's that extreme year. You remember in the 1,000-year chronology, 2002 was off the scale dry. No other year as severe as that. And then these is the mean of multiple models run in the inner quartile of the models run for, I think, 4 different models, GCMs running them forward. But what you see is that by mid-century, the mean of the model runs of FDSI start to exceed the tree mortality thresholds and the very worst single year, which we know is killing about a bunch of trees. And by the second half, warming is what's driving this. It's not precip. When you look under the hood in the models, it's the warming. The warming is what's doing this. So there's an empirical model that makes us really nervous in the Southwest that current forests, historical forests, are not going to be able to tolerate the degree of warming that we're on trajectory for at this point. And indeed, there's people, this is a global scale model that came out recently, okay, by Duffy et al., looking at temperature, tipping points, photosynthesis, and kind of saying, ooh, you know, in a couple decades, trees aren't going to be able to sequester as much carbon. The last example I'll give, so of these Polish forest die-off sites, Bill Hammond, who's part of the task force, the IUFRO task force, Bill, over the last 2 years, has taken all those examples and others, contacted a number of you on this presentation, number of you watching this, to get the precise georeference plot location. So it comes to 1,300 plots distributed around the planet. And this is a paper in revision, again, not to be distributed. These fingerprints, Bill's presented these slides a number of times in venues like this. But I'll just say that using this, you can, and a spatially gridded, relatively new climate data set that John Abatzoglu put together, you can develop empirical relationships between what does it take to kill trees in the mortality year and what is the climate setup preceding. And if you normalize those things, what you see is there's a really strong fingerprint of these 6 variables that all have to do with half of them are drought and half of them are temperature related. So we see in almost all biomes globally, this very strong fingerprint of tree mortality. And it's these 3 are the big drivers, this warming triple threat and you can project that into the future, but I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I will just say that the intent of that database, this is in a database format. It's already up at, at the IUFRO has a website. It's not online yet because we're waiting for Bill to get that first paper out and accepted. But as soon as it is, the intent is to use that as one building block of trying to increase this global tree mortality monitoring data. There's many, many data out there. These are all those plots, all those data are from peer-reviewed publications, but we know that there's, I mean, and anyway, it's one of the purposes of this IUFRO task force is to try to be a catalyst for increasing this. And this is one building stone in that effort. And with that, I close. So thank you.
Thanks, Craig. This was a very interesting and inspiring talk. I guess, Adriana, you're leading the questions. There have been many questions, and Adriana giving you sort of like a boil down of what the most relevant questions were.
I see I ran over. Sorry, I didn't get my thing on, Henrik.
We expected this to happen.
Thanks, Craig. Amazing, alarming, and very comprehensive talk. As Henrik said, it generated lots of questions, very interesting questions as well. The first question is from Amanda Cardozo, and it's so she's interested in the mechanisms behind the greater susceptibility of mortality for larger trees when compared to smaller trees. And then she also asks whether this larger susceptibility of mortality of larger trees will lead then to an overestimation of the resistance of plants based on studies in greenhouses and in laboratories that cannot model, that cannot capture these big trees.
The second part of that's an interesting question about how that relates to, greenhouse scale measurements where you're not using ancient monster trees. So that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I'm sure there's many people here who would have thoughts on that. The first question, in terms of what is actually underlying the greater mortality of big old trees, it's almost certainly multiple processes. And again, it's not always the case. When you look at tree mortality examples around the planet, it's not always true that it's the largest trees that are most susceptible, but in many cases it is. Part of it that the Darcy's Law paper that I showed the thing, with that Nate McDowell, is just, it's if you're taller, you're resisting gravity farther, and you can literally just do the math. The physics of it in there makes it harder to get up to the tops and to the distal portions where the leaves and the growing points, the shoots, the buds, excuse me. And you often see this in dieback events where it looks like cavitation is involved. Sometimes they completely die if they cavitate into the stems or the main stem or the root, but you see they die from the top down. If they partially die back, you see they lose leaves first often, depending, sometimes they got fail-safe kind of mechanisms, it seems, either in the petioles or in the finer stems. But they die from the top down, from the outside in. And so it looks like from a cavitation standpoint, that makes sense. But again, there's a really nice paper 2 years ago now, that Nate Stevenson and Adrian Doss, looking at that in the Sierra Nevada, and there have been some debates. Maybe some of you all have been involved in that on this Zoom, but where the assertion was made using plots and combinations of plots and remote sensing in the southern Sierra Nevada, where a very large 100 million, on the order of that number of trees died, that big old trees were dying, and it was because of the hot drought. And they have this incredibly long running, very detailed plot network where I forget how many trees, 100,000 trees they measure annually in their plots, and they assess the biotic agents there. This is in Sequoia National Park. And they diagnose, they do an autopsy on every one of those trees as best they can. They train their field crews in insect and disease identification to really get at the biotic agents. And you can see that some of those trees, the big trees, tended to be pines that are dominating the signal, but it's because of bark beetles. They think that are selectively taking them out. Anyway, so there's multiple processes in there. It needs to be looked at, and including the generalization. How strong is that generalization? I wouldn't want to overstate it, but it's clear enough that there's a pretty strong signal in a lot of places, enough to be concerning given what little we got left of big old trees on this planet and how important they are.
Thanks. Another question is related to this idea of tipping points is often related to there are some signs of forest ecosystem recovery after these big mortality events, or if soil erosion from the dieback is too severe that the forests are not recovering. So basically, what's going on after the mortality?
Yeah, and I showed, I'm trying to remember which one of those had was talking about the resilience, the increased resilience post. Oh, I think that was anyway. Yeah, you get every kind of outcome you can imagine. I was looking for the slide, but our landscapes, these forests, especially here, I'm less concerned about incremental tree mortality. The land managers in Western North America have been for like 20 years now, increasingly struggling because the way they were taught to manage lands, to manage based on the past, isn't working. They're guidelines from the past. And the bigger concern here for me, because of these issues of, call it what you want, structural overshoot, but basically when you come out of a wet period into a hotter, dry period, you cannot sustain that much leaf area, that much biomass, that much density of trees. And here we know the densities were in some cases 2 orders of magnitude more than what they were pre-1900, where fire was also regulating the density of the trees. It wasn't just water. And anyway, where I was going with this is that tree mortality from hotter drought, to me, is not the worst outcome for forests. There's very few places on the planet that alone has caused forests to disappear. It causes range shifts. And in simple systems like that ecotone shift paper in '98 that I did with Dave Brashears, it was big, tall ponderosa pine and little shorter pinyon juniper. And so you could call that a biome, but really it's one tree dying and causing that. In tropical forests where the diversity is high, you might lose a lot of biomass, and the dominance shift through time, like Lucy Fawcett's nice work from West Africa showing that over time. But if you or I went into that forest, probably we wouldn't have noticed much had happened in the last couple of decades, yet the dominants are increasingly xerophytic. I think that's the good case outcome, that there is this resilience at the system scale. There's certainly, individual plants are trying it, but when you put these high severity wildfires on it, it's a game changer here in these systems. A lot of these species, we are getting what we call type conversions, and it is going from forest to non-forest. I didn't actually talk about that, but there's been a ton of work on that in the last 10, 15 years because it's become, again, it was a risk that we had some idea of because you could see some things like basically resprouting shrubs. Things that resprout are favored by these high severity disturbance events, and we're seeing conversions to shrublands and grasslands of what have been for as far back as we can reconstruct with tree rings and pollen, hundreds, thousands of years were forests, and it doesn't look like they're going to be again for a number of reasons. So there's a big spectrum of things. They're going to be place specific, and but I think these are the kinds of trends and in some cases surprises that it's going to keep people busy for a long time. documenting this in your particular home landscape, because we're going to be seeing these things as these systems reorganize, as they must.
Thanks. Another question is on the definition of tipping points for tree mortality specifically. If you know how dry is dry enough for vegetation transition. This is from Shuxiang Yi.
Well, I think those are going to be really place specific. It's kind of a variant on that framing. I mean, we need to ask those questions appropriately because they're going to be time and place specific, just like the ECO2 framing, in that recent, Martin Decaw et al. Paper, the tipping point. But it's one of the challenges out there that we, even to define just cavitation thresholds of tipping points, there's on the order of 100,000 tree species on this planet, and they behave individualistically, and we don't know for many of them. So depends on the resolution. I do think that if we had better, basically the kind of thing that Bill Hammond is trying to do, well, what, with a number of us, that it's that empirical model is, we know if we had better information on when trees died, and not just when they died, but through remote sensing when they're stressed. And of course, there's a lot of promise for that in terms of things like looking at canopy water contents changes through time and temperature of the canopy. When do they close their stomata and they're not transpiring, so they're not cooling? You can see when they're starting to be stressed. I think if we could spatially, if we had wall-to-wall, high-resolution, Greg Asner style, LiDAR with multispectral resolution repeated through time and space, we would be able to do empirical modeling across landscapes, because we would see when and where the forests are stressed and when they die, and then we would have observations of the climate that drove it, and we would be able to develop landscape or watershed or whatever scale of resolution we had data on, specific, but say landscape specific empirical models of how much heat and drought is too much. And but we're a long ways from being that, but technically, conceptually, it could be done. If there was sufficient investment, you could do this. And plots are what we got, but well, I mean, there is remote sensing, but it's often not of the resolution and repeatability, but it's potentially, it would just take a big investment, but maybe the forests of the planet are worth it. And we should make that investment given the consequences, including the carbon consequences, the feedbacks to everything else that emerges out of that. But we could do it, but plots are important to calibrate, of course, any remote sensing things as well. But if it's all you got, it's intrinsically a bit unsatisfying because they're points on a landscape. And we really want to be able to look at things distributed broadly.
Craig, we are a little bit over time, but I'm going to ask a final question because there are lots of questions here. And there is a question here, so maybe also on the mechanisms behind, the physical conditions behind these changes. One question from Gina Marano is, is soil moisture often neglected in this picture? And
yes.
And is this one of the gaps? I guess that's the question.
Yes, for sure. Below ground in general is harder. We don't have as many measurements, but we know how important soil moisture is, and it's not the same as precipitation. The soil can be a buffer or it could be an amplifier depending on its conditions. And anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, so maybe linked to that one, there is another question from Danielle Nadal Sala, asking whether you expect a shift then from populations that invest more in above ground to populations that invest more in below ground.
Yes, I do. I think that is because they're buffering themselves differently, right? I mean, when you invest more below ground in that, I mean, and by that I think of that as storing more reserves below ground, but also the potential to resprout. So, and that's the life forms we see most resilient here. If you want to be reincarnated as a resilient vascular plant in the Southwest US, come back as a clonal resprouting shrub that still sexually reproduces with seeds that are bird dispersed. So they get translocated along places. And then once you're established, you're pretty resilient to all kinds of above ground disturbance processes, whether it's drought and heat stress dieback. We haven't seen drought alone, but we don't have as good data on shrubs as I would like to have, longitudinal data. But there's been these really bad, the worst hot drought years. The shrubs sometimes don't leaf out in the spring, or they leaf out and then they die back, or they drop their leaves. And then you see the next year that they lost 25% or sometimes 80% of their above ground stems. But I haven't really seen things like the shrubby oaks or things like mountain mahogany die from that per se. But then when you put a high severity fire on top of it, like that 2011 event, all these shrubs that we expect to resprout, sometimes only 20% of them resprout post-fire. That compound disturbance is the thing that's taking them out. Until last fall's fires, those giant sequoia trees, I showed you that slide where these trees were killed by fire getting into the canopies of these trees and killing them. Some of them have been smoldering for 8 months, 10 months, okay, over the winter inside, because they have all kinds of wounds. But prior to that, Nate Stevenson, it was a small number of mature sequoia trees they'd see die during this really severe drought in 12 to 15, 16. And it was like a couple handfuls of trees, of mature trees. And those were all trees that had fire impacts at the base. So they had damage to the cambium. Many of them have big old basal scars. It got a little hot when they're doing prescribed burning. So those trees were stressed by the fire, and then the drought stressed them. And then there's a little beetle that they didn't really see was a problem on giant sequoia in the past, but a little twig beetle that they saw. It may be a different species, but it was also on incense cedar, Calicedrus, in the same forest. And those beetles seem to be on these declining giant sequoias. But again, multiple disturbances killed those sequoias, and fire is one of them. So that's part of it too. If it was just the drought, hotter drought, it's not clear these sequoias would be dying from hotter drought. Nate and colleagues documented a big drop in leaf area in maybe 20% of the distribution. I don't know the exact number in Sequoia National Park, but part of the landscape, they were more susceptible to that drought stress. And in the fall of 2014, they dropped a bunch of needles, a bunch of leaf area in a way that nobody had ever documented before. But they didn't die. They didn't die from that. And by the time they got the tree physiologists there the next year and climbed the trees and looked at the plant water potentials, the trees that had dropped leaves, needles, and the ones that did not on apparently better moisture sites, their plant water stresses were the same. So they had successfully managed the water stress by reducing their leaf area. And at some point, there's a limit to how often you can do that or how far you can. But in the short run, it's one of those morphological adaptation measures that you also see really widely observed right now. So anyway.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Thanks. Thanks, Craig. I'll pass now to Hendrik, and thanks again. I think there are many questions we couldn't answer. I'm sorry because of the time, but I'm sure you can email Craig maybe and ask the questions directly.
That's what I'm was going to say. Craig, you're a gold mine of information and knowledge, and we could be sitting here for the rest of the night. And it's even more interesting than watching the European soccer championship. So, but I guess we have to close down because people may get problems with their families, so they have to go to dinner. But as you are retired now and you have lots of time, you may receive lots of emails from all the still 130 people waiting for their questions to get answered. So I just can encourage everyone to quickly send an email to Craig. Be prepared that the email that you get in response may be as long as the responses we received now, but it's always worth it, right?
I will just note, I'm going on vacation for the first family get together in 2 years, and a wedding of a niece starting on tomorrow, Thursday. So I will be slower, but by mid-July, I'll be back, and I will try to respond. But if you don't get a response from me right away, it's because I'm traveling for a while.
That's perfect. Nobody expected a prompt response. Anyhow, thank you very much, Craig. This was very inspiring, very interesting, and we meet soon at one point. See you, everyone, and have a nice rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.